Hi, this is Paul, and I did my rough draft of Sunday video on Friday, but I think the last videos I released were Wednesday. A number of you said, I can't keep up, so you had a little break in there, but I've got a whole nother series planned that I think a lot of you are going to enjoy. Again, I've got so many videos up in my head. I usually kind of pick one has some recent things that are out and that are kind of timely, and then I'll make those, and I'll get back to C.S. Lewis and miracles, but that's going to be intermingled with all of these other things, so let's jump in. I'm going to do a short series of videos on Jordan Peterson and the Materialists. Now, I have to thank our meetup group that met last Sunday night. We're having 2 meetup groups a month now, usually a Sunday afternoon group and then a weekday evening group. And our next weekday evening group will be the 28th. Jordan Peterson is coming to Sacramento on the 27th, so I've got VIP tickets and going to get the handshake and the photo and my one sentence into him, but it'll be fun. If you're in Sacramento and going to the group, stop by, shake my hand, introduce yourself. I'll tell you about the meetup. If you haven't been coming to the meetups and you're a Jordan Peterson fan in Sacramento, you're really missing out, because this group is outstanding. There are some very highly educated people in this video. There are some blue-collar people in this group. There's some blue-collar people in this group. There are some tech worker people in this group. There's some professional social workers, a lawyer, all over the map. And at any given meeting, a different mix shows up, so the conversation is always mixed, and we just have free-flowing conversations. There's some pretty serious atheists, and of course I'm a pretty serious Christians, and people sort of in between. So it's a terrific group. So if you're in the Sacramento area, we've got one guy drives up from Fresno. We have usually a few people that come in from the Bay Area. So it's just been an awesome thing. So if you're in the Sacramento region, please try and find it. We're on meetup.com. You can find us there. Sacramento Jordan Peterson meetup group, and if the timing works out, please stop by, because the group is great. Anyway, one of the things that we talked about in the group was Jordan Peterson and the Materialists. He is doing a lot of conversing with materialists. His conversation with Joe Rogan and Brett Weinstein, another member of the intellectual dark web. You had his conversation with Matt Dillahunty that I gave a fair amount of in-depth treatment to. Upcoming conversations with Sam Harris, but then a video I was very much looking forward to, because I know this was taped a number of months ago, and I've just been aching to see this one, because I know Justin Brierley has a tremendous amount of experience talking to materialists and atheists and Christians, and if you are interested in these kinds of things, and you aren't subscribed to the Unbelievable podcast, you're really missing out. Now, the frustration with the Unbelievable podcast is that it's a radio show on a Christian radio station in the United Kingdom, and they have a lot of commercial breaks, and the shows are too short. And so some of these bigger conversations where there's longer stretches of time, fewer commercial breaks, are really terrific, and I hope Justin Brierley expands this. I'd love to see him go full Joe Rogan, because I think Joe Rogan I'm increasingly appreciative of the Joe Rogan podcast. I didn't know anything about that until I first saw Jordan Peterson on there, but I listened to Joe Rogan and Michael Pollan about the psychedelics. So, but Justin Brierley does an excellent job facilitating conversations between Christians and atheists, or between different religious groups. He's been doing that for years, and he does a super job of it. And this conversation, therefore, with Susan Blackmore and Jordan Peterson didn't disappoint. And in a sense, Jordan Peterson sits in the Christian chair, and of course Susan Blackmore on the other, and we're going to have more to say about that video as we go into this. But my point was that Jordan Peterson is spending a lot of time with materialists. The materialists are interested in Peterson, and Peterson's interested in the materialists. And this is a conversation we need to get deeper into, because there's a lot more to it than just a low-resolution binary winning and losing. Who won, Jordan Peterson or Matt Dillahunty? Who's going to win, Sam Harris or Jordan Peterson? There are these two positions embodied by these individuals are intertwined in some complex ways. So in this series of videos, I'm going to pull out some of those. I'm going to tease out some of those threads, and we're going to look at them more carefully. So thank you to my meetup group. And it was at my meetup group that, you know, my watchers are always watching, and in the context of conversation, I think of things and things occur to me. That's when you gain insight. And I think Peterson is dead on right, and he says it in the Susan Blackmore interview. You're much more of a Christian than you want to admit. That's in a sense what Peterson keeps saying to Dillahunty. He's going to say it to Sam Harris. He said it to Susan Blackmore. It really gets them going. They don't like to hear that. Now, usually they turn around and say, no, I'm not. That's not really a good retort. What they should turn around and say to Jordan Peterson is that you're more of a materialist than you want to admit, because that is true too. And that's part of the reason their conversations are so interesting, because Jordan Peterson is a materialist in some ways at some practical levels that really give the materialist modernist side a lot of heft and a lot of influence. And Peterson, does he own up to all of that influence? Well, we're going to get into that, actually not in this video, but in subsequent videos, because first I want to get, well, this is the Matt Dillahunty should just turn the tables on Jordan Peterson and say, yeah, but you're way more of a materialist than you care to admit, because I think both statements are true. And I think if you look at, of course, the hot and heavy conversation with respect to Peterson and Christianity, did Jesus have a physical resurrection from the dead? Historically speaking, in terms of how modernist Westerners assume history to be, did Thomas lay his fingers in Jesus' scars? That's the physical layer of conversation. And so when you ask Peterson about this, he says, give me 3 years, or it depends, or I'm not ready to answer that. Now, I keep saying he's an open agnostic because he isn't willing to say, along with Bart Ehrman and Sam Harris in their conversation, no, it didn't happen because miracles don't happen. Okay, well, every time you hear a materialist say miracles don't happen, what they are simply doing is giving their profession of faith from their implicit religious assumptions. Miracles don't happen. That is a profession of faith. That is a religious statement. It is also a philosophical statement. When someone says that, they are telling you what they believe, and in many cases, no amount of evidence is probably going to dislodge that, because the mind goes into refutation mode, and we say, okay, if the drawer opened on Jordan Peterson's hotel room when he and his friend were in there watching it, and he's noticing that the drawer opened, what happened? Well, a materialist will say there must be, okay, there must be a material explanation for this. That is their religion talking through. And this, I'm not saying that's a bad thing from them. I'm saying that's how human beings operate. Christians will fill in their own narrative. And again, as we're going to continue talking through this, we're going to continue to think about Jonathan Haidt's Rider and the Elephant. So the elephant might feel a little disturbed, but the rider is quick with an explanation that settles down his elephant and settles down the other elephants. That's in a sense how we work, and that's why C.S. Lewis in his book Miracles opens up with a ghost story and says the only person that I know claims to have seen a ghost doesn't believe in ghosts. That's pretty normal human behavior. So what I'm going to get into this series is truth and questions of truth and ontology. We're going to talk about the rationality rules perspective, the kind of referentialism that is implicit in the modernist truth framework. We're going to talk about truth and this referentialism in the use and the practice of basic science. We're going to get into ethics. And this, if you pay attention to the Peterson conversations with the materialists, we're always going to go towards ethics. We're always going to go towards morality, because that's where Peterson's going to want to steer them, because of basically and we're going to bring Thomas Nagel into this too again, the modernist materialists really don't have a case, which is why they're working so hard to try and establish an ethic upon materialist rationalism. And I think for 100 years, philosophically, they don't have a leg to stand on, and they never have. Now, again, when it comes to the practice of science, they've got tremendous influence and clout and credibility. And so we're going to have to tease those two things apart. Because if we're going to understand this conversation, we're going to have to understand how there's actually multiple conversations intertwined, and in the process of these so-called debates, they keep getting mixed up. One, in a sense, keeps saying, yeah, but our system of truth and matter and referentialism really works well. And the other says, yeah, but you don't actually live by your own philosophy. And this is a point that you can find being made against atheist, modernist, secular materialists for the last 100 years. And they really don't have an answer. And this is part of the reason Thomas Nagel, who is an atheist and an A-list philosopher in America today, with his book, Mind and Cosmos, that I've mentioned in past videos, that I mentioned in the Weekly Standard piece on the heretic that I've linked in a variety of my other videos, that the atheists really have no defense for that. Now, just because you have no defense for something, what do you do in the process of a debate? You distract, you deny, you dissemble, you do all of these things to try to avoid the question, because the truth is they don't have an answer for it. And Peterson's charge that they are Christian atheists, in a sense. They are professing atheists, but they act like humanists, and we're going to get into that word towards the end of this video, is a devastating charge. And in this video, we're going to see why Peterson keeps wanting to bring the fight to them and why they keep wanting to bring the fight to Peterson, because this is right in the ground where both of them see is critical for society. Okay? So we're going to get into ethics, and we're going to get into motivation. Why Jordan Peterson and the materialists keep sparring, why the materialists keep attacking religion. Now we're actually going to go in reverse order here. We're going to start from the bottom. The best moment, not the best moment, but one of the great moments in the Unbelievable series was when Justin Brierley said, "What do you think about 12 Rules for Life?" And Susan Blackmore said, well, there's a lot of stories and there's a lot of wisdom, but the Bible's in there. Here she comes. The Bible's in there. Why do you bring the Bible in there? Okay, so why are you so afraid of the Bible? Now, if you go back to Brett Weinstein and Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson, Weinstein's less reactive about the Bible. Weinstein will say there's a fair amount of wisdom encapsulated in the story, but it must be updated to the present time. And I would argue what the church does and what theologians do is specifically that practice. They work the historical frame problem. Now, theologians and pastors and the church don't get much credit in a modernist secular frame because of some of the factors that we're going to look at. Well, why does this poor woman scream? And Peterson's look is priceless at this moment. And because I think Peterson understands. I think he enjoys some of the annoyance. He understands full well what's going on here between him and the atheists and why he bugs them and why they bug him. But again, we're going to have to tease out these threads as we go through this series. Now, their main contention, and Susan Blackmore makes this point a number of times in the video. I don't think I'm going to play it because I don't know. I always get tripped up with the copyright stuff and playing videos. Maybe I will in a later video, but Susan Blackmore, I'm assuming many of you who are watching this will have watched that video. And if you didn't watch the Unbelievable video, and if you are following Jordan Peterson in that conversation, this particular video is a must-watch because it is one of the best conversations on this matter. And actually, Peterson would have done well to bring Justin Brierley in to mediate his conversation with Sam Harris. We'll see how Brett Weinstein does on this. But Justin Brierley has years of experience hosting these conversations and meeting them. If I were Jordan Peterson and I were looking for someone potentially available to, help illuminate me to the broader world, Justin Brierley would be on my short list. My watchers get a little noisy sometimes, and they're not all that. They're smart in their own little domains, and they're not real smart in other domains. So sometimes they put other names in my head. No, not that Justin. Another Justin Brierley. Justin Brierley would be on my short list. Now, what Susan Blackmore does again and again in this video is basically say, and she makes an assertion, and she calls it evidence, without giving any evidence, that religious societies are worse than less religious societies. That is a huge subject. And she's using the United States, and she looks at some things like the murder rate in Louisiana is higher than the murder rate in Vermont. Now you might say, well, Louisiana is a far more religious state. Than the number of people who go to church in Louisiana is much larger than the number of people who go to church in Vermont. Therefore, we can see by this that religion actually has a negative effect on societies. That is an extremely low resolution way of comparing things, because anyone who knows anything about Vermont and knows anything about Louisiana, that's probably Freddie, anything that knows anything about Vermont and Louisiana would say, if you're looking for two different states in the United States that are about as different as you can be, the Green Mountain state that is losing population and is now paying people to try to move there. My grandparents lived in Vermont for a little while, so and I've had friends that live in Vermont, and I have a lot of family in the Massachusetts area, so I'm a little familiar with Vermont. Vermont is white, small, 500,000 people. There are almost as many people in the city of Sacramento proper as there is in the entire state of Vermont. Okay? Long winters. Beautiful state. If you love snow, go to Vermont. If you love green in the summer, go to Vermont. Lovely state. Vermont and Louisiana, radically different states. To say religion is the difference between their murder rates. Wow. There might be a few other differences between Louisiana and Vermont in terms of their murder rates. But this is a huge thing, and Susan Blackmore treats it as something that's non-negotiable. Now, Peterson basically says, well, I don't believe that for a minute. And Peterson, again, being a social scientist, will say, I can debunk that claim, but he doesn't really have time in this particular conversation to debunk the claim, so the claim pretty much goes unaddressed. So I want to pay some attention to that claim. Now, in my part of the difficulty whenever you talk about broad things like this is that everyone has their biases. And so I found this Maripedia site, which is an interesting site that has a bunch of footnotes for social data. And here's one, the effects of religious practice on marriage. Now, right away, when you talk about practice, when you talk about religion, you're going to have to differentiate, as Peterson does, between a professed religion and practice. And for the most part, social scientists want to look at practice because so many people in America will say, well, I'm a Christian. Well, do you go to church? And then they offer usually exaggerated numbers about whether they go to church. Do you pray? Oh, I pray all the time. Well, let's have you keep a log when you pray. And then they discover that people's profession and their self-knowledge isn't terribly accurate. This is generally speaking true of human beings. Our self-knowledge is really poor in terms of the generalizations that we hold in our head about ourselves. So a website like this will go into marriage and say, being married is very important by religious practice. People who go to who have their religious practice weekly find marriage very important. Divorce and separation. people who, and this has been borne out in other studies that I've read, people, they say, well, the divorce rate between Christians and non-Christians is the same. Well, then they say, well, let's get down into the resolution. And when they discover that the divorce rate between, in America, most religious practice is church attendance, church, synagogue, people who participate in religion, in religious services and practice faithfully have a far lower divorce rate than people who don't. Now, religious people do get divorced too, and you're going to find religious people that get divorced, but the relevance, the relationship between them is statistically significant. Divorce and separation, people who go to church at least monthly by structure and religious practice during adolescence. Marital harmony and satisfaction, some very interesting surveys here. Very happily married people. People who are religious are more happily married than people who are not. Feels wanted during intercourse. Well, there's an interesting survey. People who are religious, or frequency of religious practice is higher, feel wanted and needed during intercourse more than other people, which I find a hilarious statistic, but completely believable, being a religious person. I'm not going to talk about my sex life. Feels thrilled, excited during sexual intercourse. So if you go to church, you will have better sex, at least according to this survey. But please don't have sex in church, okay? Go home and have sex, not in church, please. I can tell you stories about that. So, very interesting studies. Some of these studies are old, but lots of footnotes. So, and then crime. I found another one on crime. Shoplifting during adolescence. People who go to church shoplift less than people who never go to church. People who go to church regularly, adolescents who go to church regularly, steal less than adolescents who never go to church. Assaulted someone by religious practice. People who go to church weekly assault people less than people who never go to church. Arrests among adolescents. Adolescents who go to church regularly, weekly, are arrested far less than people who never go to church. Now, this I think passes the sniff test of just about everyone. And you can very quickly say correlation does not equal causality. If you go to church weekly, you will not be arrested. There are many variables in there, but there are probably also some that go together. There's a lot to that, which makes a lot of this stuff fairly weak. Now again, and I think a lot of the researchers have an axe to grind in this, and that is also going to affect research. So, I tried to find something on the other side of it, and Psychology Today has a piece where David Noyce, misinformation and facts about secularism and religion. And he goes through criminal behavior, marriage and family, unprotected sex, happiness, altruism, outlooks, so on and so forth. And he basically says, well, look, he's written a book, Non-Believing Nation. So he's got his own axe to grind in this. So I thought, well, I'm going to find someone who has their axe to grind, who is doing some interesting stuff. Now, before I get to her, I want to talk a little bit about religion and herd mentality. Again, elephants and riders. The norm in America is that people's religion are deeply impacted by their context. We understand sociology of knowledge. And as a pastor, it's my job to pay attention to people's religious practice and religious profession. And my professional opinion, based on a lifetime of anecdotal conversations, is that people are inconsistent and notoriously so. People believe a hodgepodge. It's a religious salads bar that they pick up in their head. And it's a mix of whatever works for them, whatever sounded attractive, whatever celebrity believes that they like, how they were raised, what their parents believed, the religion of those who hurt them, the religion of those who were nice to them. It's a jumble. The watchers are working, and this is why there's huge variation out there in the public among people who practice religion. And this is even true of those who have highly disciplined religious practices. One of my favorite things to do if I have time on a Saturday morning is wait for the Jehovah's Witnesses to come to my door. The Jehovah's Witnesses will come to my door and they will, want to give me their little tract and all of this stuff. And then I'll sometimes invite them to sit down and we'll have a conversation. And what I do in this conversation is I play a little game. And the game is this. I know enough theology of Jehovah's Witnesses that I know what is heresy and what is orthodoxy for their religion. And I basically try to catch them in Jehovah's Witness heresy. I don't expose them or mock them or do anything like that, but it's part of my little social science experiment because I want to see how sharp these door-to-door evangelists in the Jehovah's Witness community are on their own doctrine. Now, as you would expect, many of them are pretty up to date. Why? Because if you are going to go door to door for the Jehovah's Witnesses, you have very strong reasons, not only religious reasons, to invest yourself in their particular sect and in the teachings of their particular sect. But I regularly find Jehovah's Witnesses wobbly on issues like Christology and the Trinity. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses are famous for being, let's call them, sub-Trinitarian. Jehovah's Witnesses have very different ideas about who Satan is and who Jesus is, and they have very different ideas from the Orthodox creedal positions on the nature of Christology. And again, because I have training in all of this, and I know something about church history, and I know something about the history of the Jehovah's Witness movement and the Jehovah's Witness sect, it's kind of fun to quiz them on these things and see where they stumble. And every now and then I'll be a little pissy, depending on if they push me a little hard, I'll start pushing them a little hard. And it's a fun little game, and we all leave friends and we shake hands. And, for me, part of me thinks this is probably nicer than just continuing to have doors slammed on your face, which is what everybody does in my neighborhood on Saturday morning. Not everybody, but they come down around with such regularity that when I see the car parked and people fitting a certain demographic, wearing certain style clothing, getting out of the car, I know the Jehovah's Witnesses are coming. Our brains are amazing at pattern recognition, and so we see these folks coming a mile away. Anyway, the norm in America is a religious salad bar inside people's heads, including mine. My head is a jumble of all of my stuff, too. Again, this is part of the reason I'm a Calvinist. I'm not saved by what's in my head, okay? Now, I'm sure that's going to trigger a whole bunch of theological commenting in the comment section for this video. It's helpful to measure religious practice as well as professed belief. It's really helpful to look at them both. People regularly profess to greater church attendance than they practice. Same with giving. Same with smoking or drinking, if the religion has things to say about those things. The rider wants to make the elephant look good. That's part of the rider's job. So if you're going to be a decent social scientist on this, you're going to want to get deeper and look at the level of behavior. And those of you following Jordan Peterson would find this to be no surprise. Now, just as a Jordan Peterson meetup is a wonderful thing, a comment section on a YouTube channel is a wonderful thing. And the commenters that comment on my videos, for the most part, are an amazing group of people, because I have learned an incredible amount from you commenters on my channel. And I regularly harvest book recommendations. I harvest YouTube recommendations. It's a YouTube culture, so a lot of you promote YouTube, say, have you seen this YouTube? And I do try to at least take a look at the YouTubes that you often recommend to me. And so actually 2 videos within this video are from recommendations from commenters in the comment section. Why is psychology silent when it comes to atheism? This is a video from a few years ago by a scholar, Dr. Melanie Brewster, who I think I did a little bit of research on her. I think she teaches at Columbia now. She identifies as queer, but she also identifies as an atheist. And so she taught at Skepticon, and she had a fascinating presentation for me, which I appreciated greatly, on why is psychology silent when it comes to atheism. And I want to play some parts of this for this video because she has some really important things to say, and it is very much germane to the Jordan Peterson conversation. And again, this is why the comments section is smarter than Google, because Google will queue up for me videos to watch, and they're pretty good at knowing what I want to watch based on what I've watched before. But the comments section, and you all watching and leaving comments, have a much higher level of intelligence. You can find patterns and correlations that even oppose things, and so when you prompt me videos, they're even better. So let's listen to Dr. Melanie Brewster, and I recommend watching the whole video, whether you're an atheist or a Christian, because it's a very worthwhile presentation.
No one doing this work. And I mean, we can think of a number of reasons for why this might be happening. It could be that as students, people are discouraged from kind of doing this work. Their mentors say, watch out, you need to get a job, don't talk about atheism yet, you don't want to offend anybody. It could be that because of that, people are afraid. Maybe people are just disinterested. Maybe people think that atheists are mean and unapproachable, and why would you want to give voice to them and their experiences? So I didn't really know for sure. But I hypothesized that it could also just be a product of the climate of the United States. So we know that the US is very religious. Since 1992, when you poll Americans, roughly 80 to 90% report that religion is very important in their lives, or important in their lives. And that does not change. It's been a stable number. And it could also be that religiosity and God talk really permeates everything we do, whether we're religious or whether we're non-religious. So what we say to somebody when they sneeze, how we conduct our birth rituals, our death rituals, our marriage rituals.
These are some of the points that are implicit in Peterson's "This all is shaping you, atheists, to be Christians, or to act like Christians, or to assume Christian language," so on and so forth.
They all have God in them. What we say when we orgasm, oftentimes God is there too. We cannot escape it.
See, religious people have better sex.
So,
is Matt Dillahunty an atheist in bed? That's what I want to know.
With the millennial generation, I know we always talk about this, things are shifting in some ways. So we know that 40% of people that are over 75 attend church at least once a week. But we know that millennials, so people that are 18 to 30, only attend church about 12% of the time, so less frequently. However, I don't want you to think that because attendance rates of church are dropping, that says anything to do with atheism growing, because it doesn't necessarily. So this is a kind of depressing conglomeration of statistics that I'm going to throw at you right now. But in 1937,
Depressing for Skepticon.
1948, 1989, 2008, when we regularly ask questions about belief in the afterlife, at each of these time points, 70% of Americans say they believe in an afterlife. So that has remained very stable, even though people are attending church less frequently. What else do I...
And this gets into my point about the religious beliefs of people. It's a salad bar. Comparatively, there's something big to be gained by believing in an afterlife, and it can be gained cheaply. Happy hunting ground, streets made of gold, the life you've always wanted, even people who it's fashionable now to talk about reincarnation. Nobody I know who talks about reincarnations imagines themselves to be an immoral person who is going to be reincarnated as a rat. They all imagine I'm a moral person, and because I've thrown off Christianity and I've embraced a higher spirituality, I know my next life is going to be a better life than this. And nobly in my next life, I'm going to continue working through the things that I haven't resolved in this life, but I know I'm on an ascendant pattern. This is pretty typical of people's self-serving bias when it comes to religious ideas. And part of the problem that atheism has is there's so little payout in denying any afterlife at all. Okay, so it's the big sleep and you're dead. Well, what's the payoff? Well, I won't be in pain. Okay, but what do the other 70% have? Oh, I'm going to have fabulous sex, or I'm going to have wonderful wealth, or it's going to be nature, whatever idyllic imagination they have, they can project it into the afterlife. So there's really not much benefit to saying there is no afterlife. And even Steve Jobs, again, in his in the biography I read of him, when he's getting close to death, he's talking to the biographer and he's kind of hoping for more. Of course, especially if you're Steve Jobs, you're going to hope for more. You had a pretty good run in this life. Why not want for more? And what does it cost you to want for more? Now the atheist community says, don't say that. Well, now we've got the stereotype of angry, joy-killing atheist, which is another barrier that they have in their project.
I want to say about this. I think that's it. So clearly, as psychologists, faith is very important to examine because so many of us as Americans are faithful. And psychologists have absolutely taken note of this. As a field, we are very, very interested in belief systems in general. That's kind of our bag. That's what we do. And religiosity and spirituality are no exception. We're interested in those too. And so for the past 30 years, there have been so many studies done on religiosity and spirituality. So just to give you a sense, this is the number. So if you do a quick EBSCOhost search, and EBSCOhost, for those of you that aren't kind of geeky academics like me, it's a research database that kind of pulls all the peer-reviewed scholarly journals across a number of different disciplines. And so it's kind of a searchable index, and you can put in keywords, etc. So my students and I, to prepare for another project, did just a really quick preliminary search on articles that had keywords related to religiosity, spirituality, and psychology too. And that's the number that we came up with. So 480,000 articles. And this is a huge, huge, huge number. Huge. And this is not to say, I hope I'm being really clear on this, this is not to say that there haven't been historical issues and pushback on doing work about religiosity within psychology. There has been. It wasn't always something that you could talk about openly, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. But clearly, within the past 20, 30 years, the grounds have been really fertile to do this type of work. If you see a number that enormous in terms of peer-reviewed literature within the past 12 years only. So if you look at what this literature tends to say, and you sum it up with this extremely, extremely scientific chart here, you see on the x-axis commitment to faith, and commitment to faith is measured in a wide variety of different ways. It could be the number of times you attend church, how much you pray, how strongly you feel about God, and then on the y-axis, all things good in life. So the trend tends to suggest in this literature that more religious you are, more good things in life that will come to you.
Now I'm going to keep playing this and we can go later in the video, and I'm going to balance this out because my assumption, when I recommend a video, I imagine a few of you will watch the whole thing, and I don't want you coming back and saying, you misrepresented the video, so I'm not going to misrepresent the video. But what's interesting to note here is that Susan Blackmore in the video basically kind of throws out, we all know religious societies do worse than more secular societies. Well, how do we all know this? Well, research says so. Well, here you have a genderqueer Columbia University professor replete with graduate students, which are probably even more powerful than a comment section or a meetup group, who says this massive amount of literature, that if you want to dilute this down into a binary representation, Susan Blackmore is just wrong. Just wrong. Now, Melanie Brewster is going to comment more on this, and we're going to follow her correction on this, and I think it's a fair correction. But I want to mark this here because Susan Brewster just kind of throws this out. And one of the things we don't hear from the celebrity atheist is contending with this material. And now they could post the argument that Melanie Brewster is about to post in this video, which would be a legitimate argument to make, and we're going to engage with that argument a little bit too. But if you want to, number one, cite social research, number two, do it in a binary generalization, I'm going to have to trust Melanie Brewster here, because she has no implicit bias to make religious sound good. The whole point of her mission at Skepticon is to say atheism is better. Cool, that's her mission. But Susan Blackmore's take on this is just plain Wrong. But she throws it out. All right, so we're doing a little fact checking. See what more she has to say.
And just to tease that apart a little bit more, so religiosity and having more of it is linked with satisfaction with life, less depression, being less socially isolated, a number of really positive psychological outcomes. And to give a quote by some of my favorite researchers, acclaimed authors, number crunchers, Robert Putnam and David Campbell, they wrote that all other things being equal, the life satisfaction difference between a non-churchgoer and a weekly churchgoer is slightly larger than the difference between someone that earns $10K a year and a demographic twin, so somebody that's completely equal to them on all demographic variables, that earns $100K a year. That is huge, 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 huge.
Huge, huge, huge. Did you hear what she said? Religion is more powerful in making you happy than money. Okay? And people, I know a number of my atheist friends are, why do religious people give so much money to their religious institutions? I don't know. Why do you give money to Hollywood to show movies? Why do you give money to Netflix? Why do you spend your money on drugs? Why do you spend your money on travel? Religion makes you happy. It's huge, huge, huge in the words of Melanie Brewster. Religion is, throughout human history, one of the things that has most reliably made people happy. And here's one of the dirty little secrets. What is it going to cost for me to go hear Jordan Peterson visit Sacramento? I got top tickets for that with the VIP thing. I spent big. Why? Well, that's a complicated question for me, but I did spend a lot of money for this. I'm unusually motivated to go hear Jordan Peterson, and actually I'm listening to what he has to say is of secondary importance to me. I mostly go to these things to meet the other people around, and there's a guy out there, Black Knight so and so, I forget his whole thing. But he says that really it's part of my evil feminist plot to infiltrate the Jordan Peterson community. So be warned. Anyway, religious people, you can come to Living Stones and never put a dime in the plate, and no one will ever stop you from coming. In fact, there's plenty of people who do that. Then there are a very small number of people who support my ministry and support my church in a very big way. And it's not really my church, it's really their church, because in the Christian Reformed Church, I'm not the boss of this church. They could fire me. I work for them. And they are generous in letting me take time making videos for you all. And they see this as part of my mission, which I do too. But huge, huge, huge. Religion is hugely effective in making people happy. And huge social science confirmation of this in an enormous number of surveys.
But we're not going to leave it at that, because clearly we are at Skepticon and we don't necessarily take these things at face value. So we're going to break this down.
And she's going to break this down. And like I said, watch the whole video. The whole thing is good to watch. And there are lots of factors. And so what she finally gets to is that there's now I forget what it's called. Well, let's watch the video. We'll go to the end. I'm saving you time.
So here's this chart again. And what happens when atheists are actually included in this chart?
Now, again, her main point is that all this social science studies religious people, who are the majority of people in the United States. Canada's a little different, okay? Mexico's different still. Other countries are different. But in the United States, the majority of people are religious, and all of this intense study of religious people. And her point is there's like zero, very, very, very few studies on people actually studying atheist people. Now, her main argument is basically it's about cultural dissonance. Now, remember, she identifies as queer. And so one of her big agendas is to say that minority groups get distressed because of their minority status in a population. That's a big agenda for her in other realms. And her argument here is that it's hard to be an atheist in America. And I hear this especially from some of my atheist friends that live in the Bible Belt, which always kind of cracks me up, because here I am, a Christian living in one of the more secular parts of the country, and maybe I'm irritated by my minority status, but I've got my atheist friends living in the Bible Belt, and so they're irritated by their minority status, which gets into another point, that the United States is an enormous country, and the whole country is not the same. And what the country really is a system of interconnected bubbles with tiny little different atmospheres, and the bubbles go down in concentric circles. If you are a lonely atheist living in the middle of a Christian family, you will feel lonely. If you are a singular Christian living in the middle of a skeptical or atheist family, you will feel lonely, and these bubbles scale up. Okay? So this is her major thing, and so now she's going to go into the back end of her presentation here.
Well, it turns out that there are a few studies that show that it's starting to change really dramatically. This pattern does not hold when atheists are included. And again, this is a small crop of recent studies. They're good studies, though, by social scientists that have very intentionally included atheists along with religious and spiritual people. And so when atheists are actually included...
Now, pay attention to atheist, religious, and spiritual, because the spiritual people are, in a sense, disorganized religion. That's individualistic religion. Okay, religious people work in communities. Individual people who say, I'm spiritual but not religious. I listen to I listen to New Age people on the radio. I'm into The Secret. I'm into yoga. I'm into crystals. I'm into tuning forks. I've got a lot of friends like this, so I know a lot of the stuff that they're interested in. They would be spiritual but not religious because they don't regularly attend a specific religious institution or identify with a formal religion.
This relationship becomes curvilinear, and I'm going to break down what that means for you. It looks something like this. And so what matters instead is the degree of certainty of your beliefs rather than your beliefs themselves. Atheists look extremely, extremely similar on mental health outcomes as do religious people. They look very similar. Instead, the people that actually have less all things good in the world regarding their mental health are people that are more unsure or fuzzy on their beliefs. So people that are kind of trying to discover themselves, to find themselves, those are the people where we see more mental health concerns. And in a lot of ways, this makes sense because we know that a stable worldview, no matter what your stable worldview is linked to better mental health.
Right there. A stable worldview, no matter what your stable worldview is linked to mental health. This term mental health is not as fixed as we might like to imagine, or perhaps even that we might need it to be. Okay? And especially when we get into conversations of religion and mental health, things get complicated. But I think her point here is a really vital point. What makes for mental health stability and happiness? It's usually, and this is part of her bigger point, it's usually similarity along all of the various layers of worldview. Now, if you get into Peterson and he talks about every time you deconvert or convert, every time you change your mind, a little part of you dies. That little lobster dies. Oh, I got my lobster over there instead of up there, sorry. The little lobster dies and another lobster grows. The crustacean changes his shell. Okay? And so people in transition between worldviews are experiencing a lot of dissonance. Now, this makes perfect sense because transitions are all about dissonance. You have dissonance, so you change positions. If you're going to church and it isn't working for you, Dr. Phil talk, you start trying something else. If you're out there drinking and smoking and screwing all you want and it isn't working for you, well, you try something else. And you're going to have variability in mental health. You're going to have variability in terms of your relationships. Again, thinking about Alan Jacobs' How to Think book. We don't think alone, we think in groups. And if you move from Christian thinking to atheist thinking, you probably were embedded in amongst a whole bunch of Christian thinkers, and you're going to change your group of friends. If you are an alcoholic and you're trying to get sober, what does every program tell you need to do? You need to change your group of friends. Why? We are elephants and riders. We are herd animals, and we believe in herds. And so if you want to change your belief, you need to change your group. Why? Because all of our watchers are continually influenced by our situation, and it is really hard. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to step out from the pack. Now again, even by that little metaphor, we imagine you are alone, but what you are really doing is changing herds. That, in fact, causes more dissonance because we tribe up in order to compete. Now, a little later, we're going to get into Jonathan Haidt when we get into these dynamics. So her point about minority, I can't remember the word, dang it. Minority dissonance. Minority, if you're in a minority, it's hard. If you're queer, the world is so gender binary. If you're gay, the world is so hetero. If you're used to living in a very hetero world and a whole bunch of gay folks move in, you've got a lot of dissonance. And phobia isn't really the right word, but it's probably more angst and irritation. And it isn't necessarily as tied to the things themselves as they are to the herds that we're traveling in. Okay? These are really important points. And these points are really not terribly, these points are really commonsensical and I think baseline. But these are the points we so often forget when we start dealing with a lot of these conversations. Well, does she go too much further? Let's see.
So this is something that when you hear that, oh, atheist, it's unhealthy, you can fire back with data like this now.
Fire back.
We know that it's not. We're actually very similar.
What? Atheists are similar to Christians? Well, yeah, in a lot of ways. Why? Because they're working a stable belief system, and we like stability. We don't like change.
But there is one thing that can actually impair the mental health of atheists and has been linked to distress. And that takes us full circle to minority stress theory again.
That's the words I'm looking for. Minority stress theory. Here we go.
Which is my original passion. And
that's her original passion as an atheist, queer person.
When you have experiences of stigma and experience of discrimination, those can impact mental health.
Now, I know I just triggered a whole bunch of you Jordan Peterson fans out here because this woman, I would guess, is a social justice warrior. I started following her on Twitter. I'll see how warrior-like she is.
And they do for atheists as well. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go too into this, but my students and I did a large-scale study, some of which many of you might have participated in because we had over 1,300 participants. And we tried to break down the type of discrimination that atheists faced. And it turns out that there are a few different dimensions of it. People thinking you're immoral, people saying you bring shame to your family, people asking you to pretend that you're religious, being ostracized and kind of shut out of social circles, and then severe discrimination too, like not getting a job because you're atheist, or getting fired because you're atheist. And so
Even Donald Trump had to find his childhood Bible to become president of the United States.
We gave a measure that assessed these different dimensions, and we asked people to rate how frequently these dimensions occurred in their life. And what we found was that discrimination faced by atheists, this is the first time this has actually been looked at, actually is linked to mental health outcomes for atheists.
See, you're a victim. All my atheist listeners, you're a victim. Why don't you become a social justice warrior for atheism? You need atheist pride parades.
Each of these dimensions, and the more frequently you occur them, is linked to a higher level of psychological distress and more loneliness. And these findings, I think, were surprising for many people that I've talked to them about, because a lot of people say, well, why does it matter if religious people think you're bad or evil or immoral? They're stupid. They believe in a big sky monster. We don't care what they say. But when it comes to discrimination and the people that have these negative attitudes towards you, or your friends, your neighbors, your family in some instances, it does matter. It matters a lot. So discrimination does impact us and impacts our mental health. And this kind of fits into the larger minority stress framework and what we know about other marginalized groups like people of color, like LGBTQ populations, and like other kind of stigmatized religious groups. But the good thing is that we do know that there are certain buffers to this link between discrimination and poor mental health outcomes. And one of them is community building. And I know that when we hear community, a lot of people go, we don't want that, we're atheists and we are independent, we don't need that. But it can be really positive for our mental health. And it's been shown to be linked with positive mental health outcomes for many other marginalized groups. The downside is that religious congregations within the United States are the most common form of community. And oftentimes religious congregations are the only form of community that anybody has any connection to.
And if you bring in religious communities, the strongest ones are the countercultural ones, okay? So if you're a Jehovah's Witness, you have a really strong community, because not only are you against all the other Christians, the Trinitarian Christians out there, you're against the atheists and everyone else. If you're a member of the Latter-day Saints community, the Mormons, you are, the more sectarian your group, the potentially stronger that cohesion will be, because you need each other in order to continue to maintain your cherished belief system.
Attending a religious congregation is linked to a number of things. Religious people who attend churches actually do more civic engagement. They do more things to help our neighborhoods, our youth, our health organizations, art and cultural groups. And people who attend church regularly as a part of their community actually donate more to secular causes than secular people. So you are a culture of do-gooders that actually do more good for secular people if you're religious, which is hard to take in and really awkward. So the question that I want to ask you now
we get the sermon portion of the presentation,
is knowing that there's research that supports that community is good for people that experience stigma and discrimination, people like atheists. Wouldn't it be nice to have an atheist community? And I know this isn't a new argument, and a lot of people are doing this. There are people across the country that are starting to do this. And cultures like, or communities like ethical culture that have been around since the late 1800s. But if you had a community where you knew people cared about you, where they could pick your kid up from school, where they could bring you flowers in the hospital, all these sorts of things would make the day-to-day lives of atheists much better, much happier.
And we're going to get more into this a little bit later too. So, well, there you have it. And again, what's her axe to grind? Well, she's a queer atheist, talking at Skepticon. So Susan Blackmore, with this business about religious, really doesn't have a leg to stand on. And in fact, you will find not a lot of awareness amongst the celebrity atheists along this line. You don't find a lot of, anyway, I just posted the evidence. I'm sure a lot of you will have comments. Put them in the comment section. What you have before you is a complex matrix. Now, here's the question. What makes you happier? Well, is that the question? And Peterson and Susan Blackmore will get into that. Is it happiness that we're getting at? And actually, that's a good part of this video. What gives you an experience of meaning? Peterson will say, we are more deeply tied to meaning than happiness. Young men throughout history have, for the sake of meaning, taken up arms and at the risk and often cost of their lives, given their lives for their social groups. And they've done so for meaning, not for happiness. You can endure almost any what? Am I getting this right? You can. It's Viktor Frankl and it's Nietzsche. You can endure almost any how if you have a why. Viktor Frankl, after the concentration camp, his meaning system of psychotherapy was, do you have a purpose in life? Embrace that. You'll be happier. It's just true. Happiness and meaning are nested within culture, religion, group, and stigmatized groups. So, but here's the question, what makes you more moral? Well, how do you define moral? Well, let's, in the back of C.S. Lewis's wonderful book, which a good number of you people out there that are really interested in Jordan Peterson should read The Abolition of Man, because so much of Jordan Peterson's complaint about the university was made by C.S. Lewis in the mid-20th century in his book, The Abolition of Man. And in the end of the book, remember C.S. Lewis had rejected Christianity and then converted to Christianity himself later in life. At the end of The Abolition of Man, he has this little section called the Tao, where Lewis goes through and shows some basic moral commonalities across religions. And most atheists I know would embrace that same list. And many of them are in the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, or his manservant, or his maidservant, or anything that is your neighbor's. Now, basically, the Ten Commandments has two tables of the law, as it's often called in my tradition. The first is love the Lord your God, and the second, love your neighbor as yourself. The bulk of the second table, most atheists will say, yeah, that's common, obvious, reasonable law. What's more difficult, however, is to actually say that we ground those in reason. Now, we, the riders on the elephant, can usually identify good reasons to follow it, but did we follow them because of reason, or was something else involved? And that's where we begin to get into Jordan Peterson, his from below, and Jonathan Haidt's arguments from below as well. Let's do a case study. I want to talk about rating culture. A lot of people, when they read the Bible, say, oh, there's all this violence. I had a sermon where I mentioned the siege of Samaria and these two women who are have this pact to kill and eat their children. Okay, and if you say that's just so horrible, well, this stuff is normal in extreme situations in humanity. Read the story of the Great Hunger during the Stalin years in Belarus and Ukraine, and the stories of capitalism in there. I've mentioned before Timothy Snyder's book, The Bloodlands. Depressing, vivid history of that. Well, guess what? A lot of the stuff in the Bible is common to humanity. We say, oh, that archaic God of the rating culture. So if you read the book of Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, the little kingdoms fighting each other in that reason. Now people are nested. So you have the individual, then you have the family, then you have the clan, then you have the tribe. So we're nested in all of these different groups. Now, one of the things that has been common throughout human history have been what I'll call rating cultures. And if you read Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, you will get introduction into rating cultures. And rating cultures basically do this. If my little group or clan or family is stronger than yours, you can find this in the book of Psalms, blessed is the woman who has many sons. Why sons? Patriarchy. Well, also because one man versus one woman in a battle, generally speaking, the woman loses. Why? Biology. We are, because of testosterone, evil testosterone, bigger and stronger. And I am 6'4", 200. I lost some weight recently because it's good for my health. 225 pounds. If I meet a 130-pound woman, unless she's got special training in martial arts, she really doesn't stand a chance against me. I'm just way too big and way too strong, and she might put up a fight for a little bit, but very quickly I will master her. And it's just physics and biology. Is it unfair? Yeah. It's the way it is. Okay. So rating culture. What is rating culture? Well, my little group over here, your little group over there. You got stuff I want. You know how much work it is to go out there and grow my own food? It's a lot. And it's not terribly fun work. What's more fun? If you believe the story that we all involved on the Serengeti, we're hunter-gatherers. Well, guess what? Guess what hunting is akin to? Warring. So we're hunter-gatherers. So my little clan here, my little tribe here, your little tribe here, I can go out there and work my field, or I can sit around and wait till you work your field and you harvest your field, and I swoop in and I steal all your grain. And while I'm at it, if I see any women that look good, I'm going to take them. And I might grab some children too, because they might make good slaves. This is basic raiding culture, and it has operated throughout world history. And you'll say, oh, but we've evolved beyond all that. Well, how have we evolved beyond all that? And how far away is this actually? A really fun book to read is Hampton Sides, Blood and Thunder. And it is the story of Kit Carson and the conquest of the American West. That's a nice subtitle. What it's about is the subjugation of the Navajo peoples. Now, why the Navajo? Well, the Navajo were one of the most successful people in the desert Southwest that America grabbed in the Mexican-American War. And one of the things they very quickly had to try to do is subjugate the Navajo. Why? Because the Navajo were a classic raiding culture. Now, this gets very complicated because classic raiding culture, how did they raid? And we think raiding culture, we think people riding in on horses. Now, pay attention until 1493, and I mentioned that book before, another wonderful book to read. When suddenly the world got connected, when globalization started in 1493, suddenly they get horses. Suddenly they get sheep. In other words, if your imagined immemorial image of the American Indian culture or Native American culture are Native Americans riding horses and ranching sheep, nothing of that happened before Columbus. So once horses and sheep and pigs and all of these other things got introduced to the Americas, also fueled by the mass die-off because of the germs that came over because of domesticated animals. Again, read the book 1493 by Charles Mann. Well, this changed everything in the Americas dramatically. And you can find YouTubes. If you search for Charles Mann on YouTube, you can find short presentations of his thesis there. It's a dramatic presentation, and it will unsee a lot of things that is in your mind. Crash Course too, the brothers that do history there, they've got some of that integrated in Crash Course videos that are very compressed. If you're not used to long videos, you're not watching me. But so this is going on. So you've got Navajo raiding culture, and you've got, well, who are they raiding from? Well, you've got the Mexicans. Well, who are the Mexicans? Well, the Mexicans are a mix of people with Spanish ancestry and Native American ancestry that are identifying with the Mexican state, but they were not able to subjugate the Navajo. And so what is happening during this period is that the Navajo continue to raid and steal from the Mexicans, and the Mexicans get fed up, and then they get their army together and they march up and they bang on the Navajo, but they can't trap the Navajo. The Navajo are too good at this. And so the Mexican people living in villages are incredibly frustrating. Well, you have the Mexican-American War, and the Americans come riding in, and Mexico can't put up a fight against the United States. That becomes a whole other problem. But basically, the American army comes in and says, we'll fix the Navajo problem. Well, how will they fix the Navajo problem? Well, that's the story of this book. And it's a very interesting story. It's a very sad story. It's a very painful story. But it's basically the story of modernity. Now, we're talking the middle of the 19th century. So we're talking the same century as Darwin and as all of this history that we've been talking about. But here in the bubble of the American Southwest, in the conquest of the United States over Mexico and seizing this land in which I live in now, we're talking about them ending a raiding culture. Now, what's the benefit of this? Well, we can actually know a fair amount about raiding cultures and what this is like and what goes along with it. And a lot of this is in this book, and it's fascinating reading, and I would recommend reading it. There is slave taking. Now, for the most part, the Navajo really didn't practice slavery the way the Americans were practicing slavery, or even the way the Mexicans were practicing slavery. often, and this is true throughout the history of the collision between Americans and Native Americans, you know, the Native Americans would kidnap people from the Americans, especially children, and say, we can't let you live like them. Now, a little while later, Americans would do exactly the same thing to the Native Americans and say, we can't let you live like them. Here, we're going to put you in schools in America. Well, but in Native American terms, they lived in the village. And there are many, many stories in this period of people from Anglo ancestry kidnapped by Native Americans, integrated into the tribe, and then raised. And if you want to see a movie about it, Dances with Wolves is in there. Okay? He's Dances with Wolves, and she is, I forget her name. Some of you, again, the comment section is brilliant. You'll look it up and you'll put it in the comment section. But this kind of thing happened all the time. Now, the way this conversation tends to go in our highly low resolution social justice warrior conversations is all of this gets completely obliterated. So again, my plea, whether it's you're talking about black-white relations or Native American relations, are get it to a higher resolution. It will help in the conversation. It doesn't mean that injustice goes away. It just means that the clear lines between justice and injustice get quite a bit more blurry, and the whole thing gets a lot more complicated, which is like today where things are very complicated. So read Blood and Thunder. Terrific book. But there's slave taking, there's kidnapping, there's sheep stealing. And the U.S. Army promises to end all of this. Now, what is happening here in another resolution? What we are dealing with are empires. Okay, and I've talked about this in previous videos because this is a very big theme in the Bible. And I'm going to quote some of Yuval Noah Harari and his book Sapiens, which was a fascinating book, and it was a fun book. So here's what he has to say about cultures. We do like seeing underdogs win, but there's no justice in history. We're going to get into Harari a little bit later. Most past cultures have sooner or later fallen prey to the armies of some ruthless empire. Okay, now if you follow my Ezekiel series, this is the story of Ezekiel. Israel falls prey to the Babylonian Empire, or Judah. Israel falls prey to the Assyrian Empire. David and Solomon raise a Israelite empire and subjugate Moab and Edom and the Philistines and the surrounding nations. Okay, this is the story of empire. Well, what is an empire? How do they work? And more importantly, when we get into this obvious, supposed obviousness and rationality of morality, are empires moral? This is a very complicated question. Well, ruthless empires. And so one way to talk about the Kit Carson and the subjugation of the Navajo people is one of ruthless empire. However, let's see if I include this. However, what we fail to recognize is the Navajo themselves were playing the empire game in their raiding culture. If you go down to the desert Southwest and you look at the cliff dwellers, if you find old signs, you'll see this word Anasazi. Well, where did that word come from? It was a Navajo word, and they often dress it up like ancient ones or ancient enemy or shitheads who used to resist us. Okay? Anasazi has now been put away because we're going to talk about ancient Puebloans, because who are these people? Ancestors of the modern Pueblo people, including the Hopi and the Zuni, or the Puebloans, do not prefer the term Anasazi. Why? Because the Navajo were the empire, a little tiny one, and the Hopi and the Zunis were their vassals, their servants. And they were in competition with the Mexicans, but the Mexicans were too big, so they could only nibble at the edges. Now the Americans come through, and the Americans are going to fix this. The American empire is going to solve the Navajo problem. Well, what is the Navajo problem? It's just another empire. They're playing the same game, but unfortunately for the Navajo, even if they get up to speed with sheep and horses and some guns that they can get from the Mexicans, the American army has far more resources, far more population, far more imperial cohesion, and the story of Blood and Thunder is the story of Kit Carson and how they subjugated the Navajo, and it's a very sad story. It broke Kit Carson's heart. Well, back to where we were. So Harari says there's no justice in history. Empires, too, ultimately fall. The Navajo Empire fell. But they tend to leave behind rich and enduring legacies, just like the ancient Puebloans and their cliff dwellers that a couple of summers ago I went to look at. They were really cool. Almost all people in the 21st century are the offspring of one empire or another. Oh, we're all tyrants? We're all downstream from tyranny? We've all benefited? We're all living in the privilege of empire? Yeah, we are. What is an empire? An empire is a political order with two important characteristics. First, to qualify for that designation, you have to rule over a significant number of distinct peoples. That's the difference, let's say, between an empire and a kingdom, or an empire and a clan, or an empire and an extended family. First, you qualify that you have to rule over a number of distinct peoples, each possessing different cultural identity and separate territory. How many peoples exactly? 2 or 3 is not sufficient. 20 or 30 is plenty. The imperial threshold passes somewhere in between. Now I'm going to jump to the Kindle book. I think I have Blood and Thunder up, which again is fascinating reading. Harari, do I have you up here? Yeah, here's Harari. Move this. Where was I? Okay, we've got my Kindle book open. So first, empires they incorporate multiple distinct cultural groups. Second, empires are characterized by flexible borders and a potentially unlimited appetite. They can swallow and digest more and more nations and territories without altering their basic structure or identity. Okay? The British state of today has fairly clear borders that cannot be exceeded without altering the fundamental structure and identity of a state. A century ago, almost any place in the world could have become part of the British Empire. Cultural diversity and territorial flexibility give empires not only their unique character, but also their central role in history. And thanks to these two characteristics, that empires have managed to unite diverse ethnic groups and ecological zones under a single political umbrella. Now consider the American Empire, which we are currently in. Therefore, fusing together larger and larger segments of the human species and planet Earth. Now, think about this in terms of all of our talk about diversity. Why do American presidents talk about diversity so much? Well, because they want to keep people together. And here's the irony. Barack Obama talked a lot about this pluralist American people. He's speaking the language of empire. Okay? Ronald Reagan, I played a little clip from his City on a Hill speech. You have high walls, but open doors to let the people of the world stream in. This is empire. Christianity has a fairly strong imperial element to it. Christendom is imagined to be an empire, okay? If you look in Revelation 6, you have peoples from every tongue and language. Well, so you had that in the Roman Empire. And that's why in the Bible there's this competition between the empire of Christ and the rest of the world's empire. Read the book of Daniel. It should be stressed that empire is defined solely by its cultural diversity and flexible borders, rather than by its origins, its form of government, its territorial extent, or the size of its population. Now, this makes Trump interesting because, in a sense, the fear of Trump playing to white nationalism is, ironically, an anti-imperial message. part of the difficulty that Germany would have in World War II was it was acting like a nation and also like an empire. And so, for example, when it conquered the lands east of her, it wanted to exterminate the people so the German people could have elbow room. All right? And so if we're asking the question about empire and race, empires that want to stress racial homogeneity are going against the stream of how empires have worked in the world today. You almost never hear these conversations or this aspect when you're talking about race and diversity and empire. If someone would say, I believe in racial diversity, you would say, oh, you're an imperialist. No, I'm not an imperialist. Well, that's key to empire, is to allow people, and otherwise you have a kingdom. In a sense, look at the modern state of Israel. They're not playing the imperial game because they are an identity kingdom. The Europeans today that are resisting outsiders, they're playing identity kingdoms. Japan, which famously does not allow immigration and also famously is going through all kinds of struggle because they don't allow immigration, they are playing an anti-imperial game by trying to play the ethnic kingdom game. And these games have been played throughout human history on a broad scale. So it should be stressed that an empire is defined solely by its cultural diversity and flexible borders rather than by its origins, its form of government. There can be multiple forms of government used by empire, its territorial extent, and the size of its population. An empire need not emerge from a military conquest. The Athenian Empire began its life as a voluntary league, and the Habsburg Empire was born in wedlock, cobbled together by a string of shrewd marriage alliances. Nor must an empire be ruled by an autocratic emperor. The British Empire, the largest empire in history, was ruled by a democracy. Other democratic, or at least republican empires have included the modern Dutch, French, Belgium, and American empires, as well as the pre-modern empires of Novgorod, Rome, Carthage, and Athens. Size, too, does not really matter. Empires can be puny. The Athenian Empire in its zenith was much smaller in size and population than today's Greece. The Aztec Empire was smaller than today's Mexico. But both were nevertheless empires, whereas modern Greece and modern Mexico are not, because those formerly gradually subdued dozens and even hundreds of different polities, while the latter have not. Athens lorded it over more than 100 formerly independent city-states, whereas the Aztec Empire, if we can trust its taxation records, ruled 371 different tribes and peoples. How is it possible to squeeze such a human potpourri into the territory of a modest modern state? It was possible because in the past there were many more distinct peoples in the world, each of which had a smaller population and occupied less territory than today's typical people. If you listen to my Sunday sermon, you hear about the Shunammite woman. Well, to be a Shunammite meant you were from a town. Now, I can say I'm a Sacramentan, but there are 500,000 people in Sacramento, about the same number of people as are in Vermont. So what we're looking at is a different way of looking at human populations, okay? The land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, which today struggles to satisfy the ambitions of just two peoples, easily accommodated in biblical times dozens of nations, tribes, petty kingdoms, and city-states. Empires were one of the main reasons for the drastic reduction in human diversity. Well, let's think about that. Let's think about how we value what we call diversity and why we say, well, it's horrible what the American Empire did to the Navajo. They reduced the diversity. Yes, this is what empires do. Empires reduce diversity. I don't identify myself from any tribe on my father's line. I suppose my line goes back to different places in what was ancient Israel, and somehow I came through there. But how do I know? It's all been blurred in the blenders of empires throughout history, and I'm thousands of years into that. Even the Dutch, if you're there, if I talk to Dutchmen like I did last night, I'll mention the Frisian. They know what I'm talking about. Most Americans don't know who the Frisian are. Derek Zeil knows who the Frisian are. He's one of them. The people in the Christian Reformed Church of Whitensville, Massachusetts very much know who the Frisian are. They're in many ways a Frisian church, as is Pleasant Street. Maybe Pleasant Street is more Frisian than Pleasant Street, or maybe Fair Lawn is more Frisian than Pleasant Street. Anyway, empire is one of the main reasons for the drastic reduction in human diversity. The imperial steamroller gradually obliterated the unique characteristics of numerous peoples, such as the Numantians, forging out of them new and much larger groups. I'm an American. All our conversations are about Americans. Are people who were born in places other than Western Europe with white skin Americans? Yes. America makes citizens out of diverse groups. Well, how can we do that? Well, that's a really important question. Evil empires? In our time, imperialist ranks second only to fascist in the lexicon of political swear words. The contemporary critique of empire commonly takes two forms. Empires do not work. In the long run, it is not possible to rule effectively over a large number of conquered people. This is one of the knocks. Even if it can be done, it should not be done, because empires are evil engines of destruction and exploitation. Have you heard this argument before? Every people has a right to self-determination and should never be subject to the rule of another. How about the Kurds? How about the Jews? How about all the little tribal groups of Africa that empire hasn't really fully assimilated or disrupted? From a historical perspective, the first is plain nonsense. Empires do work. That's why we keep working them. And the second is deeply problematic. The truth is that empire has been the world's most common form of political organization for the last 2,500 years. You can absolutely not understand human history without empire. In fact, most of recorded human history is recorded because of empire. If we didn't have empires, we would know far less about our past. Okay, I'll keep reading. And for those listening, it's going to be hard to figure out when I'm reading and when I'm just talking, giving commentary. Those who are watching the videos can see it because I've got the page up. Most humans during these 2.5 millennia have lived in empires. Empire is a very stable form of government. Most empires have found it alarmingly easy to put down rebellions. In general, they have been toppled only by external invasion or split within ruling elites. Conversely, conquered peoples don't have a very good record of freeing themselves from their imperial overlords. Most have remained subjugated for hundreds of years. Typically, they have been slowly digested by the conquering empire until their distinct cultures fizzled out. In other words, empires are really good at cultural genocide and do it very, very well. For example, when the Western Roman Empire finally fell to the invading Germanic tribes in 476 AD, the Numantians, the Arverni, the See, I get used to reading the Bible once, but not some of these. The Helvetians, the Samites, the Lusitanians, the Umbrians, the Etruscans, and a number of other forgotten peoples whom the Romans conquered centuries earlier did not emerge from the empire's eviscerated carcass, like Jonah from the belly of the great fish. None of them were left. The biological descendants of these people, who had identified themselves as members of those nations, who had spoken their languages, worshipped their gods, and told their myths and legends, now thought, spoke, and worshipped as Romans. I am more American than I am Dutch or Hebrew, for that matter, by a long ways. In many cases, the destruction of one empire hardly meant independence for subject people. Instead, a new empire stepped into the vacuum created from the old one, collapsed and retreated. Nowhere has this been more obvious than the Middle East. The current political constellation in that region, a balance of power between many independent political entities with more or less stable borders, is almost without parallel any time in the last several millennia. The last time the Middle East experienced such a situation was the 8th century BC, almost 3,000 years ago. From the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 8th century BC, which took out the northern kingdom of Israel, and this record remains in the Bible, until the collapse of the British and French empires in the mid-20th century AD, the Middle East passed from the hands of one empire into the hands of another, like a baton in a relay race. And by the time the British and the French finally dropped the baton, the Arameans, the Ammonites, the Phoenicians, the Philistines, the Moabites, and the Edomites, and the other peoples conquered by the Assyrians had long disappeared. True, today's Jews, Armenians, and Georgians claim that some measure of justice that has been the offspring of the ancient Middle Eastern peoples, yet there are only exceptions that prove the rule, and even these claims are somewhat exaggerated. It goes without saying that the political, economic, and social practices of modern Jews, for example, Harari is a Jew, owe far more to the empires under which they lived during the past 2 millennia than the traditions of the ancient kingdoms of Judea. If King David were to show up in an ultra-Orthodox synagogue in present-day Jerusalem, he would be utterly bewildered to find people dressed in Eastern European clothes, speaking a German dialect, Yiddish, and having endless arguments about the meaning of a Babylonian text, the Talmud. There were neither synagogues, volumes of Talmud, nor even Torah scrolls in ancient Judea. Building and maintaining empire usually requires the vicious slaughter of large populations and the brutal oppression of everyone who was left. The standard imperial toolkit includes wars, enslavement, deportation, and genocide. When the Romans invaded Scotland in AD 83, they were met by fierce resistance from local Caledonian tribes and reacted by laying waste to the country. Read Blood and Thunder. How did the U.S. Army beat the Navajo? They burned their crops, they stole their herds, they couldn't get a hold of the Navajo because they were too good at hiding in their home country. They could starve them out of the hills. That's how they subjugated them. And then they marched them to a land that was not their own, where they almost died, and the American government, in mercy, which is an unusual thing in empire, let them go home on the condition they would raid no more. That's the story of empire. They say, oh, the Navajo are victim. Yeah, but so are the Hopi and Sunni, because that's what the Navajo did to the Hopi and Sunni. Everyone's been a victim. Does this mean, however, that empires leave nothing of value in their wake? To color all empires as black and disavow any imperial legacy is to reject most of human culture. Imperial elites use the profits of conquest to finance not only armies and forts, but also philosophy, art, justice, and charity. A significant portions of humanity's cultural achievements owe their existence to the exploitation of conquered populations. So profits and prosperity during Roman imperialism provided Cicero, Seneca, and St. Augustine with the leisure and wherewithal to think and write. The Taj Mahal could not have been built without the wealth accumulated by the Mughal exploitation of their Indian subjects, and the Habsburg Empire's profits from the rule over its Slavic, Hungarian, and Romanian-speaking provinces paid Haydn's salaries and Mozart's commissions. No Caledonian writer preserved Calgacus's speech for posterity. We know it thanks to the Roman historian Tacitus. In fact, Tacitus probably made it up. Most scholars today agree that Tacitus not only fabricated the speech, but invented the character of Calgacus, the Caledonian chieftain, to serve as a mouthpiece for what he and other upper-class Romans thought about their country. And this goes on and on and on and on. And then Harari will go through this, and Cyrus, and so on and so forth. Well, who builds empires? Harari makes the point, cynics don't build empires, believers build empires. Well, what do they believe in? They have to believe in something. It might be the cult of the nation. It might be the cult of the emperor. It might be the ideology of the founding fathers inscribed in the independence, in the Declaration of Independence against the British, that gets brought out by Martin Luther King Jr. and tries to hold America to its founding documents. Why do all the monuments in Washington, D.C. look like ancient temples? If you look at the George Washington Memorial, what is it? It's an obelisk. Where do obelisks come from? Egypt. If you look at the Lincoln Memorial, what is the Lincoln Memorial? It's a modernized version of the Temple of Zeus. Google the Temple of Zeus. Zeus sitting on his big throne, dominating the room. You walk into the Lincoln Memorial, who do you see? Abraham Lincoln sitting on his throne. If you go into the Jefferson Memorial, an ancient person probably would have bowed down and worshiped at the feet of the giant statue of Thomas Jefferson or Martin Luther King Jr. These would have been considered idols. They function in a similar way in terms of religion. Now, this is not the religion that you'll hear materialists talk about. This is why cynics don't build empires, and why an imagined order can be maintained if a large segment of the population, and in particular large segments of the elite and security forces, truly believe it. If, let's say, Donald Trump survives, doesn't get impeached or kicked out of office by 2020, and he doesn't get reelected, Joe Pocahontas, Elizabeth Warren, who says she's not running, beats Donald Trump in an election. Let's imagine that happens. And Donald Trump says, it's a fraud, it's a fake, it's illegitimate, I wasn't voted out. Okay, I'm staying. Well, now suddenly we have the question, what do the troops do? The troops do what they believe in. Why, when you join the U.S. military, do you pledge allegiance to the president? No. You swear an oath to maintain what? The Constitution, the text. When you pledge allegiance to the flag, you pledge allegiance and to the republic for which it stands. When a president is inaugurated, he puts his hand on a Bible and he pledges to maintain the Constitution. The speech that Theoden gives as they're about to storm the armies of Mordor attacking Minas Tirith. You have pledged oaths. Today you are to fulfill them. This is how humanity works. You cannot have an empire without an implicit religion, an implicit narrative. This is why postmodernity will never work. At least not if you look at human history. Christianity would not have lasted 2,000 years if the majority of bishops and priests failed to believe in Christ. Why is the mainline church in so much trouble numerically? Because, well, what do they believe in? I just saw Schrader's First Reformed. Boy, I want to talk about that. But it's in limited release and not a lot of people have talked about it. I got to wait a little while because I want to talk about that movie. American democracy wouldn't have lasted 250 years if the majority of presidents and congressmen had failed to believe in human rights. The modern economic system would not have lasted a single day if the majority of investors and bankers failed to believe in capitalism. These religions, now we might not designate them as religions, but these axioms beneath our behavior govern the structures that we are dependent on, the immaterial structures, the relationships. Well, what are you looking for? Religious civilizations do worse. There's never been a civilization that isn't religious. It just depends on the religion. Unity of belief is important for a sense of well-being, says Sam Harris. Well, I'll tell you, it goes way deeper than this.
Religious freedom works if there's some other deeper religious value commonly, even implicitly embraced. The word God does not show up in the American Constitution. The President of the United States, anyone who serves the United States in Congress, the Christian Forum is having its synod right now, and when you go to synod, you go up in front and you sign your name on the covenant of office bearers. You make an oath that you will uphold these documents, these standards. This is how empire is played. There needs to be something you believe together. And if you don't believe it together, you lose your empire. And you split and have two. These are the big conversations we're having in the United States. Case in point. We're going to invade Iraq. We're going to liberate the Iraqi people. And Iraq is going to become a modern secular democracy in the heart of the Middle East. And that democracy and freedom is going to spread out throughout the Middle East. Is that what happened? No. Why? Duh. Almost everyone knew it wasn't going to happen. Why? Well, because of these aren't the religions that hold them together. How did Saddam Hussein hold Iraq together? Tyranny. You can use fear to do that. It'll work. But if you have a country where you have to put walls around it to keep your people in, you're not doing so well. How does religious content matter? It matters tremendously. That which you are religious about will determine the character of your culture. And so when we talk about a culture war, these are the conversations that we're having. Now, undo the invasion of the American Empire on the Navajo. Was it a moral improvement that the United States ended Navajo raiding culture? Now, be careful, because you might say, well, according to our narrative, the Imperial Americans oppressed the Navajo. Did they? Yes. Did they do it brutally? Yes. But on what scale? Now, let's go back to pre-American subjugation of the Navajo. The happiness of the Navajo men and women. Was the Navajo system better than the American system? How are you going to decide better? Were the Navajo men and women happy? Happiness is actually a rather poor thing to measure. It's very hard to measure. Were they happy? Well, some of them were and some of them weren't. And some of them were happy about some things and some of them were happy about other things. The men who did well in their hierarchies established by raiding and stealing and kidnapping were probably quite happy. Those who were kidnapped, at least at the beginning, were maybe unhappy, but maybe if they liked living in the Navajo village more than the Mexican village or the Pueblo village, maybe they became happier. Maybe they became sadder. This is how people live in this realm of consciousness that's right here in front of us. So, which is better? This is a really hard question to answer. Happiness of those who are kidnapped? How was the tribe treated by its neighbors? How did it treat its neighbors? Now, again, I mentioned the Anasazi. Now, if you read the book a little bit, you've got the great Navajo chief Nabona, and he was a polygamist. If you were a high status person and he was physically taller than almost everyone else, let's see if I can jump into that book without too much trouble. So this chapter tells the story about Nabona, who grew up a young Navajo, and he was taller, he was a better warrior, he gained wives, he gained influence. Now, of course, a group like the Navajo would have various clans within them, and he was at the point that he took a second wife. His raids of the Spanish settlements intensified, and he became known as the Great War Chief. During one raid, Nabona captured a young Zuni woman, and she became one of his wives. Does this sound like a moral man? Well, how do you find morality? Is it rationally based? One of the problems that the materialists have with morality is that their version of morality is way too conveniently aligned with all of the religious people in their country. It's not different enough to imagine it's this pristine, universal, never going to be changed morality. So he raids, picks up a Zuni woman. She becomes one of his wives. She was probably very unhappy at the moment she was being captured. Maybe 3 or 4 years later, after she becomes the great war chief's wife, maybe she likes him. Maybe he's good in bed. Maybe he's a good provider. I know he is. He's probably the wealthiest man in the tribe. Maybe now she has status over other women. These are very complicated questions. Is this a good system where wives can be kidnapped and then become queens? Is that a good system? Well, it's nice if you're queen. It sucks if you get kidnapped and forcibly married to some putz. Well, what are our values? Choice is our value. Well, in the moment that she was a Zuni girl, did she choose to be kidnapped? No. Did it wind up good for her? Yeah. These are very complicated questions, especially when you get down to the level of the individual. And so he's raiding the Spanish. Well, what happens in the story is that the Americans come along. And Nabona, who is now the great chief, he's getting a little old, he's looking at the writing on the wall. He said, yeah, the Mexicans, we could handle the Mexicans and we could maintain our way of life. And actually, if you're a raiding culture and you maintain your strength over another culture that tends to be more prosperous, the more prosperous the cultures you're raiding get, the more prosperous you're going to be. That's how, that's how this game works. Well, the Americans roll in. And at first, the Americans think, we'll take out the Navajo. Didn't prove to be so easy. And the Navajo think, we'll deal with the Americans like we deal with the Mexicans. That didn't prove to be so easy. What does Nabona do? He's thinking, we're not going to be able to subjugate the Americans or raid on them like we were the Mexicans. Okay, so what are your choices? I'll tell the young men to stop raiding. It's a hierarchy, right? You're the chief. You tell the young men not to raid. But what have you done? Now you've got your internal problems. How are the young men going to achieve status? How are they going to rise up and replace Nabona? That's the system. Nabona has to look at changing the entire system. So he tells the young chief, stop raiding. Well, what does this do? It splits. And the young warriors continue to raid. And Nabona says, stop raiding. You're going to kill us. And they don't listen to the chief. No, I can't stop raiding. I'm a young man. I need to improve my skills. I need to rise up in the hierarchy. I need to grow and develop. Well, what happens? Well, the Americans come in and they draft Kit Carson into the effort and read his background. He knows Native American peoples very well. He marries them. He sleeps with them. He lives with them. He speaks their language. In some ways, he's one of these liminal people that can work both sides of the equation. And he basically says, if you want to subjugate this people, you have to do something unspeakable to them. You have to burn all their fields and you have to starve them out. Well, now we're back to the siege of Samaria in the book of 2 Kings. You have to starve them out. This is how you win. Well, how do you win World War II? You have to nuke cities. You have to firebomb Dresden. You have to bomb London. How do you win a nuclear exchange? You have to threaten New York City and Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles, California and Sacramento, California with nuclear annihilation. The same game is being played, and I think today Trump and Kim are meeting. Well, there you go. We're still playing the same game. Now, we get all moral and we say, polygamy, slavery, imperialism, We have good reasons to talk about morality in these conversations. But it's not quite so easy and simple as we like to imagine. And what's most important, we're not quite so pure. So, is raiding culture good? You tell me. Now, revisionist history. In the Christian Reformed Church a couple synods ago, we had this big thing about the doctrine of discovery. And, well, see, all these bad imperialists have come over and with their theological expression imposed this on native peoples. So in other words, native peoples who kidnapped white children and raised them because they said, we can't let these white people raise their children. They don't have enough food in their village. Disease runs rampant in their village. Who wants to go to school until they're 25? That's no way to live. We're going to bring you out and you're going to get to run and play and you're going to get to hunt and shoot and your life's going to be great. And for a lot of Anglo kids that were kidnapped by Native Americans, when they were liberated, the kid said, I don't want to go back and live like that. I'd rather live like this. Makes sense. Well, the empire comes over and sees all these children of the Navajo, and who wants to be raised like this? We'll build schools and we'll educate you. Okay, well, what's that called? Imperialism? Cultural genocide? Is this a mixed bag? Absolutely. You can no longer speak your native tongue. Why? Language and identity and religion are so close. Conquer the tongue, you conquer it. Well, now, years later, this group says, we need to repent of what we did. What group in the Christian Reformed Church most resisted this narrative? Was Classis Red Mesa. It was the Navajo. First they said, you didn't ask us. Second, they said, many of us were raised in these schools, and although looking back on it, we don't think what they did to us was right. Many of the teachers that came and cared for us were kind, wonderful, loving people, and they brought us the knowledge of salvation. Well, how do we listen to that? Well, now you've been brainwashed by the empire. Or were you given the message of salvation? So what religion does the doctrine of discovery imagine to promote? And what religion is being promoted and embraced by Classis Red Mesa? These are really hard, important, difficult conversations. And what we tend to look at is the political layer or the social layer, and we tend to look through different lenses at them. And what we should really be having is a theological conversation, which again is exactly what Jordan Peterson wants to try to have with the materialists. So, materialists and ethics. How can you decide the good? Is rating culture good? Why or why not? Based on rational terms. Well, that which promotes survival, that which promotes happiness, that which promotes meaning. Well, I think a lot of those little white children who were kidnapped by Native Americans would say, I'm happier with the Native Americans. Well, then all the social justice people say, woohoo, that's wonderful, until you say, yeah, but they're running their own little empire games, and they were kidnapping. And in fact, they were playing the same games that the empire later played on those same populations and said, we can't let them raise their children. That's wrong. And it's the same kind of games we hear when the materialists say, we can't let those Christians raise their children to believe in God. This is the same game. But what's your rational basis for good? Well, ideally, rationality has the monarchical vision, and it never changes. Well, we find morality changing all the time. Although Matt Dillahunty says, well, we can update ours. Well, how do you know the update is an upgrade? What standard do you use to discern that? Well, on what time scale? And this is where Peterson attacks him and says, okay, so right now we're running this enormous social experiment via controlled reproduction and the pill. We have no idea how that's going to impact us. Same-sex marriage. Now we're running this huge social experiment on same-sex marriage. We have no idea where that's going to go. Gender binary. I'm going to resist the gender binary, and I'm going to try to raise my child not letting them think they're a boy or a girl. What's that funny little dangly bit down there? We don't talk about that. Oh, I have no idea how they do that, but I have no idea how they begin to do that. So you're running this massive social experiment on your child. And there's other groups that say, we can't let you raise children like that. Oh, but if we start taking their children, they might want us to take our children. So let's have an agreement that parents get to raise children in the way that children should grow. Now let's go all the way back to Melanie Brewster, because what did Melanie Brewster say? Well, what leads to mental health? Okay, that's a problematic term. People being raised consistently within a non-diverse situation. Well, now again, we have the tension between empire and clan. You can see there's a lot going on in this. And if you read me in one way or another, you're probably wrong, because what I'm trying to do is hold all of this stuff out in front of us and say, all of this stuff matters. And it's really hard to kind of work through. At what cost? Slavery has made some people happy for most of human existence. It's good to own slaves, right? Well, yes and no. Slaves, human beings are really bad slaves, which is kind of why we like cars and animals, because animals are dumber and can be subjugated more easily than human beings. Jordan Peterson says, you're a Christian more than you admit. Well, Western celebrity atheists are promoters of Western humanism, which values individual experience of freedom and happiness. That's very high values. If done so at the expense of slaves, this is considered wrong. So, we look back on George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Now, the Calvinist, John Adams, I don't think he had any slaves. He was in Massachusetts. He was a Calvinist. But Thomas Jefferson and General Washington, they owned slaves. Bad, we say. Bad people own slaves. Simple, clear. Slavery bad. Well, I agree, slavery is bad. But most human beings have been involved in this slave thing one way or another. So individual happiness and choice is good, except with slavery. Ooh, now we have a hierarchy of values. Now what we do, and what I hear Western celebrity atheists do, is say, well, we have to agree about humanism. Well, what is humanism? Nested within is the Imago Dei, of which there is zero biological evidence by their own admission. Why do we treat people with radically different abilities? Is LeBron James a human being? Yes. Is someone lying in a nursing home in the last years of their life, crippled by dementia and unable to even maintain themselves as a basic level, are they a human being? Yes. Do we treat them the same? Yes. Why? Do we have a biological reason? No. We have a story reason. What's the story? Well, it's found in Genesis 1. Man and the woman are made in the image of God. That's the story reason. What does Dr. King appeal to in his famous speech on the steps of the Temple of Zeus? I mean Lincoln Memorial. All men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we, descendants of slaves, are making a claim on your document. Fulfill it. I am somebody. I am a man. I am a human being. This is the game we're playing. It's a story game. Because biologically, well, okay, so maybe biologically we'll establish what a Homo sapien is. Okay, how's that going to go? Peterson's main religious point. I did some of the Easter thing. The chapter 4 basically says our axiomatic foundation is the Imago Dei. Now, Peterson never says Imago Dei. I wish he would, because theologically it's a more correct term than a piece of divinity or a spark of divinity or a shard of divinity. But Peterson's going to use the term he uses. This is the metaphorical substrate beneath our culture. And he looks at the materialists and he says, you're a Christian because you're still practicing humanism and you're unwilling to give that up. Humanism, however, says Harari, might be going away because technology is going to change the definition. Because what happens when Some humans are the product of genetic engineering, are the product of technological enhancements. When some humans, well, human performance delta will increase with technology. One of the things that Peterson talks about is that the Army will no longer take people below a certain IQ level. Increasingly, those people are going to have difficulty in the job market. What is the United States going to do with these people? Do you have concentration camps or special communities or group homes for people who don't measure up and cannot contribute? Well, we already have group homes in California. We already have nursing homes for people who can't function. Is this benevolence? Yeah. Would it be better to euthanize them? These questions are not going to go away. Should they be allowed to euthanize themselves? And if so, under what conditions? Harari says, we're seeing what technology is doing. Where is this going? We're going to have the problem of useless people. And if you've never read Brave New World, read it. Because what happens in Brave New World is that, well, we take human reproduction out of the lottery, the genetic lottery that it's naturally in with men and women hooking up. Now we're going to get into memes and biology as that connects in Peterson's conversation with Susan Blackmore. And we're going to manage it so we have gammas and deltas and epsilons and betas and alphas. And the way you do what you do with a gamma or an epsilon is that you make them dumb. Well, what does that mean? You make them dumb so they'll be dumb and happy. So they can be entertained easily and they won't revolt and overthrow your imperial system. So, well, we're doing that now. Here, if you want to keep peace in the United States, watch TV. That was the mid-century, 20th century approach. Now, have a computer, play a computer game. A computer game is more engaging than watching TV. So spend your life covered with Cheetos dust in your mother's basement playing a computer game and watching porn. There you go. You have a pacified human being. You say, well, we can't get much production out of him. And we say, you can't get much production out of him anyway. I've got a lot of stories. What is the materialist utopia that the materialists are saying? All religions are eschatological, even the imperial ones. Peter Hitchen, Christopher Hitchen's brother, wrote this book, Rage Against God. Fascinating book about Peterson's point about if you displace the axiomatic underpinnings even of a thinly ontological God, that changes society. Materialist eschatologies were written before World War I, and some of them were tried. And this is where, in terms of materialism as a unifying life system, very weak, because many of the eschatologies have been tried and failed. Now they'll say, well, we've got some new ones we'd like to try. Good luck. Peterson says, I don't believe you're doing it because you don't have a clean room in terms of your ethics and your morality and your idea about what is good. Now you have Jordan Peterson's theological mission. He wants to preserve the Imago Dei. He uses terms like spark of divinity or fragment of divinity in people. He is a prophet. Now, that's a really interesting word to use with Peterson, but a number of the written pieces have said that. I think in some ways, if you understand how prophets worked in the Old Testament, that is in a sense the type of role he is playing. He is a prophet crying out that we're losing humanism because we're casually dismissing the metaphorical substrate. In time, this goes to predictable places. Time is a big function of this. Because Susan Blackmore says, there's now more atheists in England than Christians. Okay, but are they really atheists? And for how long? And what will this mean 100 years from now? That's really hard to know. The decision that my ancestors made to leave Judaism and convert to Christianity, and then my great-great-grandfather made to send my great-grandfather to America, which meant that his children survived, but his brothers and sisters and their children and their children's children were all wiped out by the Holocaust when the Germans occupied the Netherlands was hugely consequential. And the religious commitment of my father and mother were hugely consequential in my life. And my commitment to the Christian Reformed Church is hugely consequential in my life, and will have impact in my children's life, and will have impact in other lives if you're watching perhaps this video. Peterson says, we're playing with stuff we can't possibly understand or know. And Peterson's admonition is, let's stick with what's proven. Well, how will atheists preserve humanism? I don't see they really have a plan. And I'd say there's some canaries in the coal mine, because here we go. Who acts out vigorously over abortion? Why? Abortion, one way to think about abortion is it is a fringe argument of humanism. Why is it fringe? It's fringe because to what degree is a child, an unborn fetus, a human being? Well, how about those fertilized eggs that are frozen? Well, how about sperm and egg? And if you look at religious conversations, the Roman Catholic Church, why is it the Roman Catholic Church is so hard against abortion? Protestants got there late. When in 1973, when Roe versus Wade went through, many Protestants applauded it. This is something that is not terribly well known. Google it, you'll find out. These outlier cases, how about euthanasia? Roman Catholics are also the most vocal groups on euthanasia. Why? Protestants, again, are late to the game. Why? Well, I would say these outliers are canaries in the coal mine about humanism, because they are saying this woman who the doctors say has no hope of survival and is requiring costly treatment in a nursing home to keep her alive in this vegetative state is a human being. It's an extreme case. This unborn fetus, all the way back to conception, is a human being. It's an extreme case. Now, when I say it's an extreme case, don't hear me wrong. I'm saying if the center is LeBron James, or a 20-year-old college student, or someone who is able to hold down a job and contribute to society, and then we go out a little bit further to the guy playing computer games on disability, eating Cheetos, living in a group home. And they don't have a lot of good computer games in group homes. Your unborn child and your person in a nursing home with a vegetative state, this is testing the limits of humanism. Well, who's protecting humanism the most? The atheists? Many of the atheists I know are saying abortion is good, euthanasia is good. So they're eating away at the ends already. Okay, well, where are you going to stop? How about the people on disability? How about the depressed who say they no longer want to live? Now, with a couple of high-profile suicides, everyone's all over suicide. But they're not over suicide on end of life, and they're not against abortion as a factor of convenience. So, what are the canaries in the coal mine in terms of humanism? Can you keep humanism if you don't embrace the carrying costs at the extreme? And if you qualify by uselessness, you lose humanism and you're going back to other systems. Let's talk about humanism and happiness. Natural tensions between the more libertarian vision of freedom, freedom too, and the communal vision of freedom and dignity. Someone was telling me about a podcast of a ex-Navy SEAL, you'll put it in the comments section, a guy who says, you know, freedom, discipline is freedom, or freedom is discipline, I don't know. Peterson talked to this guy a couple times. I can't think of his name right now. Again, the multiple U's in the comment section are smarter than the watchers in my head. Why is freedom discipline, or why is discipline freedom? Why the connection? Because discipline allows you to do things you cannot do if you don't have discipline. This is the tension within our word freedom. Slavery works sort of good for owners. People really make poor slaves. We're too intelligent. We're too self-interested, and this is why we have this conversation in our meetup. This is why the story of the Ethiopian eunuch, this is why in the ancient world they were very smart. They knew how to control people. You cut their balls off. Why? Because you don't let them have a family. Why? Because you'll have a divided allegiance. So if you cut their balls off and you give them a choice, you say, look, you'll be my slave, but you'll have a lot of power and authority and meaning and interest and wealth, but you'll never have a family. Here's the exchange. And if you stay loyal to me, I'll let you live. If you cross me, I'll kill you. Well, people make the rational choice and say, hey, I can be a eunuch. I don't have a choice about that part. I might as well live within this. Slaves make those kind of choices all the time. This is why you beat slaves and you do the beatings publicly and you have them see the scars. Which is better, to run away for freedom or to stay here and work for the master? And so you make those kinds of calculations. Are you saying slavery is good? No. As an individual slave, you do a cost-benefit analysis and you make your decision. And people make these decisions in how many bad situations all the time? Schools, marriages, families, jobs, relationships, all the time. I won't talk about Melania Trump. What happens? Well, sex robots. Watch Star Trek, I Am Mud. This guy has these beautiful women. Well, they're not really women, they're robots. He made them. Why does he want off the planet? Because they're boring. Well, why is he boring? Well, because they're... And we're getting better and better at amusing ourselves, aren't we? Well, what if you could have someone who looks like whatever woman you think is the most beautiful woman in the world, or whatever... Let's see, with women it's different. Sort of. I don't want to go there right now. But would a sex robot be good enough? Well, it depends how lifelike she is. Well, what about if you look at Brave New World and we say human beings are reproduced by other human beings? What if in the laboratory we can grow human-like creatures that are not considered legally human beings, and we can make them dumb enough and compliant enough by genetic engineering and or different technologies so that they can functionally be our slaves? We're not breaking the humanitarian rule because they're not technically human beings. And again, science fiction has been playing with this kind of stuff for years. Where's this going to go? Utility is in tension with dignity. Why keep grandma alive? Well, you'll hear the arguments. We put down animals when they suffer, don't we? Why don't we put down human beings? What happens if we start putting down human beings? One of the conversations we had on our meetup was, is the slippery slope a true thing? And maybe Greg will weigh in on the comments. I don't know. He had a very interesting argument. Why not kill the inconvenient? Well, the inconvenient have been getting killed and imprisoned and put in camps for as long as human history has been around. If someone is not useful to me, I don't want to spend time with them. I don't watch how many YouTubes that are not useful to me. Remember, we see tools. This is built into us. And then you get back to the atheists. And this is a regular thing that crops up. Brazen sexism is pushing women out of Americans' atheist movement. Why? Well, I see tools. I see pretty girl. I horny. Well, in a Christian church, there is an entire tradition. Does it get broken? Yes. Do churches keep trying to figure out how to work on this? Yes. But there are things built into the religion over vast stretches of time that leads to the Apostle Paul telling Timothy, treat the older women in your church like mothers, family members, the younger women in the church like sisters, not as potential wives. Why? Why should there be enforced socially monogamy? Because it's better if you at least have someone than one person having 20 and you get nothing. Makes society unstable. So again, Peterson's argument is that we have been running these experiments for thousands and thousands of years, and in many cases we have historical records that lead us to believe that the shape of particular societies are not accidental, and we should pay attention to them before we start tinkering too much. We as a society tend to say, hey, we know a lot. We got technology. We got cell phones. We can do all kinds of things. Yeah, but most of these things take decades and in fact hundreds of years to fully understand the consequence, such as, for example, the internal combustion engine. Well, it was an improvement to not have all that horse waste. How many years did we have the internal combustion engine until we said, is all this CO2 we're converting from petroleum a good thing? Go ahead, have that discussion in the comments section. Materialists and religion. They are engaging in a theological debate and an ethical debate. But as is often true, a strategy for winning isn't transparent or probably even conscious. One of the comments at the meetup was, so we have these things that we call debates, and both sides, well, what do? Well, he won. Well, she won. Well, he made more sense. Well, he destroyed her. Well, she destroyed him. It's all a game. Because when they're talking, what we're hoping for, what are we really hoping for? Something insightful that will help me see the whole situation more clearly. And what we're hoping for is points on my side so I can climb up the hierarchy against my tribal enemies. That's the game that we're playing. Atheists want the goods of their Christian heritage without some of the carrying costs. Of course, we all want goods without carrying costs. Time will tell if you can live without those carrying costs. But now Peterson and the celebrity atheist, Peterson, because of his focus on the long term, is skeptical about their project and sees them as contributing to the loss of the metaphorical substrate upon which our society valuing sacred individual is constructed. Peterson is in a sense saying, if you lose the spark of divinity, the shard of divinity, the Imago Dei, as I would say in Christian terms, you will lose what we have gained, the sacred individual. Peterson is a Darwinist. Men and women need to get along and continue to have babies. His comments on same-sex marriage, on homosexuality. Why did he come down on the conservative side of that? Even if, he's not talking about outlawing it or repealing it. He's just saying, hey, look, you're in the midst of a long-term generational game. If you decide to opt out of the reproductive derby, you're just removing your genes from the gene pool. And if you decide to tinker with the family system by saying, I don't need a father to have a child, you're being naive, because the way things have developed for reasons, and even all of us today with all of our brilliance, a clinical psychologist with a PhD of various stripes doesn't know where these things go. Mean plus biology, again, that's in the unbelievable thing, is profoundly important, and I would love to see Peterson have a bigger conversation about that, because that is a really important point. Maybe that'll come up in the Sam Harris talk with Brett Weinstein, because Weinstein would be a good partner in terms of that conversation. Religion is not a spandrel. For a long time, people have been trying to figure out, where does religion come from and why? Well, religion is not a spandrel. What does that mean? It means that religion is not some accidental thing that came about. It is not a mind virus. What Peterson's saying is it is an essential element to human civilization. And if we look at empire, you cannot have empire without some kind of religion. Okay? I'll put it in quote marks for you. Without some kind of unifying narrative that explains why the soldiers why every country is not a military dictatorship, okay? And why the army doesn't become its own little cadre. This is something that America should continue to think about in terms of selective service or volunteer army. Well, these make differences for a long time. Why does America pay for public education? Because America is attempting to indoctrinate its citizens into its religion. Why is education the big fighting point over these issues? Because the question is, right now in our current culture, which religion will you get indoctrinated in? Why was there big fights over the Bible in school, evolution in school, prayer in public school? Because these elements are indoctrinating the youth in the culture of the empire. And if you tinker with that, you will lose your empire. And if you lose stability, this is why Peterson is so dramatic with this. Religion is not a spandrel. God, with or without ontology, is crucial to preserve not only a well-working society, but also the preservation of the species from a Darwinian perspective. Now, Peterson doesn't go to church. This is interesting. This is where this comes into the conversation. Can he really accomplish his goals while primarily talking to the riders? Because that's what we're doing. And what is church? Church trains the elephant. Church trains the elephant how? Through symbolism, through repetition, through ritual, through community. Peterson lives like a Christian atheist. He has trouble sitting through church. First we act, then we represent in drama. But if we want to know what someone really believes, we pay attention to the drama. Peterson is skipping the drama. He's not training his elephant. Now, he might argue there's enough within the culture for someone born in 1962 and raised, at least at his youngest years, within the United Church of Canada to have gotten something. But the amount that he got is also indicative of where he is in the conversation. And this is also gets into the interesting question of, are you ever going to go to church? Can you sit still in an Orthodox church? Well, I'll tell you, it's a lot easier going to some little Protestant church where you only have to sit still for an hour than going to an Orthodox church that is maintaining a lot of boundaries that most Protestant churches have long gotten rid of. And we can have an interesting conversation about whether that was a good or not a good thing. How about humanism without religion? Well, this is what Melanie Brewster is advocating, and this is something that's being done. I've talked before about Bart Campolo, son of very prominent evangelical, progressive evangelical evangelist Tony Campolo, and you can find those conversations. What's interesting, however, is that this really hasn't gone anywhere. I mean, count the number of humanist assemblies you can find and humanist chaplains. You got one guy, Bart Campolo, who's trying to live on Patreon, being a secular humanist. Well, now you have the problem of groups. In a sense, you've got Blue Church in America, green something or other. Pick that up out of Reddit. I'll have to throw it in some videos in the future. But you got Blue Church in America. Well, why pay Bart Campolo if you can contribute to the Democratic Party? Democratic Party is Blue Church at the poll. Secular humanist thing is usually sort of Democratic Party at non-prayer, looking for rituals that will reinforce ourselves. Well, this is where a lot of the complaining from the atheists make a real point. Putnam and Campbell say, churches are it. You atheists out there, you're pretty much on your own. You don't have a tribe. You don't have much of one. Maybe you got one through YouTube now. Maybe, you can send money to Matt Dillahunty. Maybe you can be a fan of Sam Harris, but that's not very local. And Sam Harris comes to a big city once every so often, and you can listen to him on YouTube. That is nothing like the bonds that you have in a religious group that meets together. How often? Weekly, at least. And the more you meet within that group, the stronger you are in, and the greater the value, the greater the happiness. Again, listen to Melanie Brewster. The greater the performance in terms of divorce, in terms of giving, in terms of happiness. This is all coming together, okay? And Peterson's kind of on the outside of it, and Bart Campolo, you would say to him, it's not easy to replicate a church. It's not easy to write a fairy tale. Melanie Brewster makes the argument that atheists need community. Materialism itself undermines a vibrant, metaphorical, symbolic substrate. That's why Peterson is attacking them. Can you rewrite a fairy tale or even tolerate one if the core of your effort is materialism, where you have built a suspicion of story as a true conveyor? Story is central to identity and consciousness and empire and kingdom and society and happiness and mental health. The Bible. There's lots of neat stories, but don't tell me any Bible ones, because that's a superstition we're trying to get rid of because we're fighting our own culture war about certain specific things. But when push comes to shove, most of the celebrity atheists will align with most Christians in terms of most ethical behaviors, which is why Jordan Peterson says, get off it, you're a Christian. In a subsequent video, we'll get on to get off it, you're a materialist. Let's look a little bit at Harari. I've been watching some of his videos, and there's some interesting things to talk about there too. What Harari does very famously is he works meditation, but he's an atheist. He meditates to get rid of story because that sees clearly. Well, that's interesting. Where's that going to go? Well, I really enjoy some of his books, but he's kind of following the materialist mantra. We need to get rid of story and have reason. There might be a few human beings that can imagine they're doing that and then betray their allegiance every time they love their child. The vast majority of human beings will never get there with you. It won't happen. That's not how we're wired. Well, maybe we'll recreate humanity so we can't. Good luck. Can you have a good without a story? Story always implies good for what? Telos, purpose, meaning, eschatology. You cannot have good unless you have an outcome. And if you're playing hide-and-go-seek games with your eschatology, you're not going to get very far. Compassion. Susan says compassion. Peterson pretty much undermines that pretty quickly. Are you compassionate to the atheists or to the theists? Do you love your enemies? Why should you love your enemies instead of marginalize them, subjugate them, and kill them? Christianity says you should love your enemies. People rightly look at Christianity and say, well, that's a very dangerous strategy. Yeah, it is. It only works if you imagine an afterlife. No, in the long run, you'll be better off without God. Trust me, says the materialist, which is just the same thing as the Christians say. No, in the long run, you'll be better off with God. Trust me. We're just playing the same game. Who to trust? Let's listen to Jonathan Haidt a little bit. He's always good to listen to.
But bang, we get Babylon, we get Tenochtitlan. I mean, how did this happen? And I believe a big part of the story is our ability to make things sacred. If you all around the world, people express their religious feelings in somewhat similar ways. They tend to circle around sacred objects, literally circle. These are Muslims circling the Kaaba at Mecca. And when you circle, it's as though you pass a wire through a magnetic field and you generate electricity, you generate an electric charge. Durkheim used the metaphors of electricity, collective effervescence when groups get together like this. It's not just religion. The flag is a sacred symbol of the nation. It's the same psychology. Nationalism and religion involve much of the same psychology. And this allows these men to circle around it and bond together and trust each other. But when we circle around sacred objects and we generate this electrical charge, this metaphorical electrical charge, it's as though it splits apart good and evil. We see the world in terms of good and evil, and we're good, they're evil. It's very difficult to get people to listen to reason when you have this sort of thing going on, which we all do. I just want to point out that once you take this perspective, that humans have this unique way of getting groups together, making them cohesive, and for what purpose? Why is it important to have a cohesive group? Right, to fight other groups, because our ancestors have been fighting each other and cooperating too. But we've had this dynamic of intergroup competition has been going on for a couple 100,000 years at least, and in some ways for millions of years. So once you see human groups as competing, and competing in part on their ability to become cohesive and to form communities of trust, well, suddenly it's kind of obvious that we evolved by multi-level selection, including group selection. It's kind of obvious that the genes sitting inside you today were not selected just because your great-great-great-great-grandfather beat out the guy next to him. It's because your great-great-great-great-great-great, et cetera, grandparents and their community survived the famine or survived the war when the group next to them didn't. That's why the genes we have in us are here, because of selection at multiple levels. And once you see it that way, it's easy to see how religion was an adaptation, which of course the new atheists are committed to doubting. They cannot grant that religion was an adaptation, because if it's an adaptation, then we can't just rip it out. If it's a virus, then obviously we have to rip it out. Now,
There you go. Who do you trust? Is it an adaptation? Well, how can we know? What is true or good for? Is it for groups so that we compete against other groups? Are these just relative terms? We're going to have to get back into the moral knowledge conversation. Whenever I say, is there such a thing as moral knowledge? Thinking about Dallas Willard. And again, the video I made a few times ago about him. Okay. And a number of people, even at the meetup, said, don't go there with the moral knowledge thing. Well, the materialists say there's moral knowledge. It isn't material. Well, what is moral knowledge? Can we have it? Or is it only good for my group or good for your group? Or good for the promotion of my genes and bad for the promotion of your genes? Well, now we're going to get into Brett Weinstein and our assassin robots. Are we assassin robots trying to transcend our programming? Well, why would we try to do that? Where would we get the idea of good? In a materialist perspective, how can we arrive at such a thought unless they are whispers from another world? Well, now we're back in C.S. Lewis's lap, reading Miracles, Reason, and Supernatural. Read the beginning of Mere Christianity. So, this is the beginning of the conversation, and we're 2.5 hours. So, those of you who like long videos, here it is. Those of you who like short videos, sorry. I've done a lot of long ones lately, and the rough draft of Sundays are usually about a half hour because that's a little chunk. These things will just vary depending on the videos and where we go. But why? We're going to have to get into truth. We're going to have to get into its basic usage. We're going to have to get into ethics. We've talked a lot about ethics in this video. Why does Jordan Peterson and the materialists keep sparring? Because this is right where both of them are dealing with. And the celebrity atheists want to say we can get rid of religion and we should definitely stop using the Bible, and then everything will be better. And Peterson is saying if we lose those things at our own peril, and we will likely slide, and we won't know what we're doing because we're actually making decisions for 2 and 3 generations from now, and we have no idea what that's going to look like. So our best idea is to look back and orient ourselves on the path that the elephant has followed and continue to maintain that path. So Peterson says that's why he who isn't politically terribly conservative gets all the love from conservatives and from religious people, because they hold those things in common. Even though he breaks, he's talking about Darwin. A lot of religious people don't want to talk about Darwin. He's talking about all of these things. Why materialists keep attacking religion? Again, because it's part of their effort. So, 2.5 hours, probably a record. So, let me know in the comments section. Again, this is a long one, and I'll do so. And like I said before, when we think about the conversation between Peterson and the materialists, we're going to have to tease out the threads. And really what we just started talking about was Susan Blackmore's assertion. Well, of course religious societies are worse than secular ones. Of course.